The
We have to
wind came
secure the
off the
perimeter by
flats like something
0600.
expelled
The
from a
threat level
furnace.
is critical.
It carried
My team
nothing
is
with it,
prepped and ready
no
to deploy,
moisture,
sir.
no relief,
Good. Move out.
only the fine white grit that worked into the seams of everything and settled in the back of the throat like ash. Sergeant First Class Nora Calloway stood at the edge of the staging area and felt it against her face and did not turn away. The buildings at the far end of the street were half dissolved in the shimmer. At 10:40 in the morning, the temperature had already crossed 112 degrees, and the thermometer bolted to the wall of the forward operations shack had stopped being consulted by anyone who wanted to maintain a reasonable mood. She had been standing there for 11 minutes. No one had told her where to go. Sergeant Calloway. The voice came from behind her. She turned. Rear Admiral Dennis Price stood with two aides flanking him like parentheses, his uniform immaculate in a way that suggested he had not yet walked more than 30 feet from an air-conditioned vehicle. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s with close-cropped silver hair and the particular kind of face that had grown accustomed to rooms going quiet when he entered them. He looked at her the way he might have looked at a piece of equipment left in the wrong location. "Sir," she said, "I've been briefed on your file." He did not lower his voice. Around them, 12 men from the Special Operations Unit had found reasons to stop moving. Average marksmanship, one failed deployment qualification, one incident report that apparently followed you out of Fort Bragg like a bad smell. He paused. "What exactly is your purpose on this operation?" She said nothing. "I asked you a question, Sergeant. I was assigned here, sir." Price looked at one of his aides, then back at her. "Whoever assigned you made a clerical error." He clasped his hands behind his back. "You're useless to me here. Try not to get in the way." He walked past her toward the main briefing room. His aides followed. The 12 men resumed moving, and none of them looked at her directly, which was its own kind of statement. Nora turned back to the street. The shimmer at the far end had worsened. Through it, the silhouettes of collapsed buildings wavered like reflections in disturbed water. Somewhere in that distortion, 3 kilometers out, a man had already killed 12 people and vanished each time without leaving anything behind. Not a shell casing, not a footprint, not a single thermal signature for the drones to follow. She looked at the shimmer and thought, he's using the heat itself. She didn't say it out loud. Part 1. The city that burned twice. The town had been called Marwa once, a secondary industrial hub that had processed mineral ore and employed 22,000 people at its peak. That was 16 years ago. Now it was a collection of concrete frames stripped of everything useful, wiring, pipe, window glass, and left to the desert the way you'd leave something to the birds. The streets still had their old names on metal signs mounted at intersections. Green lettering faded to gray, though the intersections themselves had long since lost any meaning. There were no traffic patterns to follow. There were no pedestrians. There was only the sand that accumulated in doorways, and the heat that sat over everything like a physical weight. The Special Operations Unit, formally designated Task Force Meridian, 12 operators plus attached support personnel. 2 had established its staging area in a former ore processing warehouse near the southern edge of town. The building had thick walls that retained the overnight chill until about 9 in the morning and then became, by early afternoon, effectively an oven. The men had learned to complete their planning sessions before 11. Master Sergeant Dale Vickers, the unit's senior NCO, had spread a satellite map across a folding table in the center of the main room and was weighting the corners with water bottles. He was a lean man in his 40s with a methodical way of moving, as if he had long ago decided to spend no motion unnecessarily. He glanced at Calloway when she entered and said nothing, which she had learned in the 3 hours since her arrival was his neutral setting. "Ghost's last confirmed position," said Captain Owen Merritt, tapping a circled area on the map's northeastern quadrant. Merritt was the operation commander in the field, 10 BL, mid-30s, from somewhere in Ohio, with the look of a man who had recently stopped sleeping enough. "Drone coverage shows nothing. Thermal returns 0 above ambient. He's either going subsurface between shots or he's figured out a way to spoof our sensors, which means we have a problem that's above my pay grade." "Third possibility," said Specialist Kyle Henshaw from across the room. Henshaw was the unit's intelligence analyst, young enough that he still typed with genuine speed. "He's not moving between shots. He's pre-positioning days in advance. We find the nest after it's been cleared." 12 kills, said Vickers. 0 nests found. Henshaw had no answer for that. Calloway stood near the back of the room. She had positioned herself where she could see the map without being in anyone's direct line of sight, which was a habit she had developed not through strategy but through years of practice. She looked at the 12 circled kill sites and thought about angles. The sites formed a loose arc. They were not random, they had a geometry that was not immediately obvious, but became apparent if you stopped thinking about them as individual events and started thinking about them as a system. She was about to say something when Admiral Price walked in and the room reorganized itself around him. "Tactical assessment," he said to Merritt, not as a request. Merritt gave it. Price listened, made 2 corrections to the proposed search grid that moved coverage away from the arc Calloway had been studying, and approved a patrol insertion for 1400 hours. The briefing lasted 9 minutes. When it ended, Price left, and the room exhaled. Vickers looked at the map. "Get your kit together," he told his men. 2 stack. "We're running the north corridor first." Calloway remained by the back wall. No one assigned her a position in the patrol formation. She was used to that. The particular experience of being in a room where the operational momentum moved around her rather than through her was one she had cataloged across enough assignments that it had lost the capacity to sting. What it had not lost was its utility as information. The shape of a room's indifference told you things about the room that direct engagement never would. She had learned more about Task Force Meridian's assumptions and blind spots in 3 hours of invisibility than she could have extracted from a week of briefings. She looked at the satellite map from where she stood and noted that Price's corrections to the search grid had moved coverage precisely away from the structural cluster she had been studying. The move was not arbitrary. It was the result of a working theory, Ghost moving east, building an exfil route, that was internally consistent and almost certainly wrong. Internally consistent theories were the most dangerous kind. They did not feel like errors, they felt like conclusions. Outside, a gust moved through the street and raised a thin curtain of sand that slid across the warehouse entrance like something alive. 2 of the operators near the door stepped back from it automatically. Nora watched the direction the sand moved, noted it, and filed it alongside the other things she was collecting. Part 2. The Shape of Contempt. The unit's designated primary marksman was Staff Sergeant Russ Garland, 29 years old, 3 combat rotations, and the holder of a qualification score that he would mention, if given the slightest opening, within 45 seconds of introduction. He was good. Nora had watched him during the morning's equipment check, deliberate, unhurried, meticulous about his zero, and acknowledged, without resentment, that he was genuinely good. He found her in the secondary equipment room while she was reassembling her rifle. "You were at Coast," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, I heard the story." He leaned against the door frame. "Version I heard was that you had the target in your crosshairs and froze." "That's one version. What's the other one?" She fitted the scope. "The other one has more details." Garland watched her work. "Look, I'm not trying to be a problem, but Price is right that there isn't a slot for you in the patrol structure. We've got a sniper element. Adding a second creates a command problem. You understand that." "I understand it. So what exactly are you planning to do out there?" She didn't answer right away. She was checking the action, running through the function check the way she had done it 8,000 times. The sequence built so deep into the muscle memory of her hands that her mind was free to be elsewhere. "Observe," she said. Garland looked at her for a moment, nodded once, and left. Vickers appeared in the doorway approximately 2 minutes later. He looked at her rifle, then at her. "You're attached to Element 2, he said. "Rear security. You stay 50 meters back from the main stack. You do not engage without my direct authorization. You see something, you call it in. Clear?" "Clear." He started to leave. "Sergeant Major." He stopped. She kept her eyes on her equipment. "The patrol route runs north along the main corridor and sweeps east through the processing district." "That's correct. The last 4 kills all came from a westerly bearing. Angles between 270 and 310 degrees from target. The north corridor puts us in the open to that entire arc for 400 meters. A pause. "That concern has been evaluated." "By who?" He left without answering. She checked her ammunition load, shouldered her pack, and walked out into the heat. Part 3. Ghost Geometry. The patrol moved out at 14:20, delayed 20 minutes by a radio calibration issue that turned out to be a loose cable housing. The delay put them in the deep afternoon heat, the worst possible time to be moving in the open, and Nora spent those 20 minutes in the thin shade of the warehouse's eastern wall, watching the way the thermal shimmer moved across the street to the north. It wasn't random. That was the thing. In a simple, uniform heat source, flat ground, consistent surface material, the thermal shimmer would rise in a relatively even curtain. Here it billowed and shifted because the surfaces were not uniform. Broken concrete absorbed heat differently than sand. Standing walls created microchannels where air moved at different rates. The shimmer was a map, if you knew how to read it. She had been thinking about the 12 kills for 72 hours since she had received the mission brief back at the main operating base and been told, with evident surprise by the officer delivering it, that she had been assigned to Task Force Meridian. She had spent those hours not thinking about the ghost sniper as a threat to be neutralized, but as a craftsman to be understood. The kills were all between 1100 and 1500 hours. Peak heat. The drones returned thermal noise during those windows because the ambient temperature of every surface was within 3 or 4 degrees of a human body's surface signature. He wasn't spoofing the sensors. He was hiding inside the physics of the environment itself, operating during the window when the desert's own heat made him invisible. She had written this analysis in a 2-paragraph summary the night before and submitted it through proper channels to Captain Merritt. She did not know if he had read it. She suspected it had arrived in the same category as her general presence, something to be acknowledged and set aside. The patrol moved. She stayed 50 meters back as ordered, left rear of the element, and watched the buildings. At 1504 minutes, Staff Sergeant Andrew Brennan, at the front of the lead element, went down. The sound came fractionally after a sharp crack, displaced by distance, arriving like a late receipt for a transaction already completed. Brennan was on the ground before anyone had registered the sound. He had been hit in the upper left arm, missing the body armor, a wound that was serious but survivable. He was already being dragged behind cover before the second thought had completed itself in Nora's mind. The radio burst into controlled chaos. Every operator was behind cover within 4 seconds. The drones, both of them, were immediately tasked to sweep the western arc. They found nothing. Of course, they found nothing. It was 1500 hours. The desert was reading 118 degrees at surface level. The shimmer was at its peak. Ghost had calculated this. He had been waiting for exactly this window, and he had used it, and now he was doing whatever he did between shots, which was the thing no one had yet figured out. Nora crouched behind a section of collapsed wall and looked west and thought about what she knew. She knew that Ghost had been operating in this specific urban environment long enough to have mapped its thermal properties in granular detail. The 12 kills were not random samples. They were calibration data. Each one had taught him something more about how heat moved through this particular dead city, how its concrete and its open ground and its standing walls interacted with the afternoon air. He had been conducting a long experiment, and each confirmed kill was a data point that refined his model. She also knew that the behavior of the drones was giving him information. Every time the sensors swept and returned nothing, he learned the current boundaries of their detection capability. He was not just hiding, he was actively studying what could find him and adjusting accordingly, which meant that any method that could actually locate him would have to be something the drones could not do, something analog, something human, something that did not emit the characteristic electromagnetic signature that he had presumably learned to watch for. She could hear Merritt on the radio, his voice professionally controlled, running through the protocol for a casualty extraction and tactical withdrawal. The right call, operationally. The responsible call. Ghost had engineered the situation so that the responsible call was also the losing call, which was the kind of tactical elegance that was genuinely difficult to dislike even when it was being applied against you. Part 4. The lesson she wasn't meant to keep. She had been 23 years old when she met him. His name was Raymond Holt, and he had been, at the point of their meeting, the highest-scoring long-range marksman in the history of a program that had been producing exceptional long-range marksmen for 30 years. He was also 61 years old, retired, and working as a contractor for a training program at a base in Nevada that did not appear in any public roster. He had a gray beard that he kept trimmed precisely, and a habit of pausing before he spoke that initially read as uncertainty and revealed itself, over time, as the opposite. He had been assigned to work with Nora's cohort for 6 weeks. By the end of the second week, he spent most of his time working with her specifically. Most people think about the shot, he told her once, lying prone beside her on a high desert range with a crosswind coming unpredictably off the ridge to the north. I want you to stop thinking about the shot. The shot is the last thing. Think about everything else. What's everything else? The air, the light, the temperature gradient between here and there. The way the heat off that rock face is going to push you around 3 inches left at 1400 meters if you fire before 2 in the afternoon. He had pointed at a basalt formation to the east without looking at it. Think about where you are in the world. You're on a spinning rock with an atmosphere that has its own opinion about what your bullet should do. Respect that opinion. She had thought he was being poetic at first. She had learned, over weeks, that he was being precise. He had also taught her other things. How to read terrain for natural hides that would be thermally invisible during specific hours. How to use local environmental conditions as both concealment and a fire control solution. How to make a shot that looked, to any subsequent analysis, as if it had come from a direction 300 degrees offset from the actual firing position, by using the geometry of reflected wind channels between buildings. She had not thought about Raymond Holt in 4 years. She had thought about his methods constantly. The distinction mattered. What he had given her was not loyalty or gratitude, but a set of tools so thoroughly internalized that she had stopped attributing them to any source. They had become, over time, simply the way she thought about problems. The way a language learned young stops feeling like a second language and becomes, instead, the texture of thought itself. She had not remembered the teacher because she no longer experienced the teaching as teaching. It had become her. Now, kneeling behind concrete in the dark while his operational fingerprints covered every surface of this mission like a signature left in ultraviolet ink, she understood why she had been the only person in the task force sent the mission brief 4 days early. She understood, with the sudden clarity that comes from seeing a pattern complete itself, that whoever had assigned her to Task Force Meridian had known, not suspected, known that she was the specific instrument this problem required, and had delivered her here anyway, without explanation, without context, and had let the process of dismissal proceed because the dismissal was not the operation. The operation was what came after. She was thinking about him now, crouched behind broken concrete while the drone swept uselessly through the thermal fog, because she recognized every single thing the ghost sniper was doing. She recognized it because she had been taught to do it. The question she had been rotating in the back of her mind for the past 3 hours, not allowing herself to complete it, the way you don't allow yourself to look directly at something that might not bear direct looking, finished itself now in the silence after the shot. She already knew what the answer was. She pulled out her range card, turned it over, and began doing math. Part 5. The wrong map. Brennan was evacuated. 2 other operators had taken minor injuries during the scramble for cover. A wrenched knee, a gash from a concrete edge. The patrol was effectively neutralized without a second shot being fired. Ghost had accomplished what he always accomplished: maximum disruption from a single action, then disappearance. They pulled back to the warehouse. Admiral Price was in the main room when they arrived, standing with his arms crossed, looking at the map. He did not ask about Brennan's condition immediately, which told Nora something about the order of his priorities that she filed away without comment. "He's moving east," Price said. "He's leaving the processing district. All 12 kills have been progressively moving toward the eastern perimeter. He has an extraction point on that side, and he's working his way to it." Vickers looked at the map. "Sir, the kill sites don't necessarily indicate direction of travel. He may be working angles rather than." "I'm aware of what they may indicate, Sergeant Major. I'm telling you what they do indicate." Price tapped the eastern perimeter on the map. "He goes to ground somewhere in the block between Marwa Industrial East and the old rail junction. We establish a cordon. We push through from the west. We find him. That's 300 meters of open ground on the approach," Marot said carefully. "We move at night. He may not be limited by daylight the way we assume. If he's using thermal masking during the day, he may have other methods for." "We move at night," Price said, with a finality that closed the conversation. Nora was standing near the back of the room again. She had her range card in her left hand, folded so that the calculations on the back were not visible. She had looked at the 12 kill sites and the grid coordinates and the timestamps, and she had done the work that the formal analysis had not yet done, because the analysis was looking at movement patterns and she was looking at geometry. The kill sites did not indicate progressive eastward movement. They indicated a firing position. A fixed firing position, or a small cluster of positions, from which all 12 shots had been taken by using different weapon orientations and the reflected wind geometry she had learned about on a high desert range 11 years ago. Ghost was not moving east. Ghost had not moved significantly in the past 2 weeks. She knew where he was. "Sir," she said. Every head in the room turned. It was the first time she had spoken in a group setting since her arrival. Price looked at her with the expression of a man who has forgotten a minor annoyance and been reminded of it. "Sergeant, the firing position isn't east. It's northwest." She held up the range card, the apparent angles of the shots at each kill site, accounting for deflection off the channel between the ore towers and the main processing block, The real origin point is here. She walked to the map and placed her finger on a structure in the northwest quadrant. The old ventilation station. Subsurface, thick concrete, thermally stable at a constant 18 degrees regardless of exterior temperature. No drone will ever find a heat signature there. He's been there the whole time. Silence. That's 1.5 miles from the farthest kill site, Merritt said slowly. 3,840 meters from the nearest. 6,200 from the farthest. She kept her voice level. Those are long shots. They are not impossible shots. More silence. Price looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Merritt. Get the drones on that structure. He did not say anything else to her. He did not acknowledge that she had spoken. He walked to the other end of the room and began talking to his aide. Vickers, passing her on the way to the radio, glanced at her range card and said nothing. But his eyes stayed on it for almost 2 full seconds before he looked away. Part 6. What the drones don't catch. The drone footage came back at 1900 hours. Thermally, the ventilation station was a blank, a concrete box that returned an absolutely flat reading consistent with the surrounding architecture, which was exactly what she had said it would do, and which proved nothing either way. The visual sweep showed a structure in partial collapse, its eastern face still standing, access points sealed by debris that could have been natural accumulation or could have been placed deliberately. No movement, no heat bloom, no equipment visible on any surface. Inconclusive, said the drone operator, a specialist named Trevor Watts who delivered his assessments with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned that assessments were minefields. Of course it's inconclusive, said Price. The man's a professional. If she's right about the position, we can't approach from any direction without being in his potential field of fire, Merritt said, looking at the map. He owns 360 degrees from that point. Every approach is exposed. Not every approach, Nora said. She had not been invited back into the conversation. She entered it anyway. There's a subsurface drainage channel, pre-collapse municipal infrastructure, about 1.5 meters in diameter, that runs from the eastern edge of the warehouse district to within 200 meters of the ventilation station's northern face. It won't be on any tactical map because it predates the satellite survey period. It's on the original urban development plans from 30 years ago. She turned her range card over to the front, where she had sketched a line in pencil. An approach through that channel gets you within 200 meters without ever being in his line of sight. And how? Price said, in a tone that might have been curiosity or might have been something colder. Do you know about a 30-year-old drainage survey? I looked for it. When? Before I was assigned to this unit. I was sent the mission brief 4 days before departure. The room was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. You spent 4 days preparing for this, Merritt said. I spent 4 days trying to understand how he was operating. Once I understood that, I started looking for approaches that might work against his specific method. Price turned to his aide and said something in a low voice. The aide left the room. Price turned back to the map. Captain Merritt. Revise the approach plan using Sergeant Calloway's drainage route. We move at 0300. He still did not look at her directly. She went to find a quiet wall to put her back against and close her eyes for 3 hours. Part 7. The mathematics of disappearance. They found the drainage access point exactly where she had marked it, beneath 30 centimeters of accumulated sand, sealed by a rusted iron plate that Vickers levered open with a pry bar while 3 men held flashlights at impractical angles. The smell that came out was ancient and mineral, the compressed history of a city that no longer existed. They moved through it in single file. Nora was third in the formation, behind Vickers and Garland, ahead of 4 others. The channel was lower than advertised in 2 sections and they crawled on hands and knees through water-stained concrete, hearing nothing from above except the distant, theoretical wind. At 0347 they emerged in the northeast corner of a collapsed maintenance shed 230 meters from the ventilation station's northern face. Vickers deployed 2 elements left and right around the structure's perimeter, maintaining the concealed angles she had calculated. She positioned herself on a low concrete shelf behind a section of fallen wall and glassed the structure with her optics. Nothing moved. For 40 minutes, nothing moved. The temperature at 0400 in the desert was different from the day, a thin cold that was its own kind of extreme, the heat-bleached air releasing everything it had held and dropping toward the 40s by the time dawn became a concept rather than an event. She kept the structure in her optics and breathed through her nose and let her body temperature equalize with the concrete beneath her. Long waiting, the kind that had no guaranteed endpoint, was something she had come to understand not as a skill but as a relationship with time. It required surrendering the assumption that the waiting would end at any particular moment, which most people found profoundly uncomfortable and which she had discovered, after enough practice, produced a peculiar kind of clarity. When you stopped waiting for the thing to happen and simply occupied the waiting itself, perception sharpened. You heard the textures of silence. You noticed the way the cold moved differently through different materials. She had learned this from Holt on the Nevada range. Though he had described it differently, he had called it being available, not present in the performed sense, not disciplined attention maintained through effort, but genuinely available, the mind in a state where anything that happened would find it already receptive. She had been available for 37 minutes when the structure changed. It was not movement. It was pressure, a shift in the acoustic character of the space around the structure. Quote, the subtlest possible indication that somewhere inside that concrete box, a weight distribution had changed. It was the kind of thing that registered not as a sound but as the absence of a sound that had been present, a frequency ceasing that you only notice once it's gone. She keyed her radio once, the prearranged single-click signal for possible contact, and did not move. 3 minutes later, a section of debris on the eastern face shifted. Not much. Enough. She was already adjusting her position before she had made a conscious decision to do so. The rangefinder read 218 meters. She noted the wind, light from the northwest, less than 5 miles per hour, negligible at this distance. She noted the elevation differential. She noted the narrow gap between two slabs of fallen concrete through which she had a line to the eastern face, and through which, in approximately 30 seconds, she calculated that someone exiting through a ground-level access point on that face would have approximately a 3-second window of visibility before reaching the shadow of the collapsed section to the south. She waited. The figure emerged. In the green-gray of her night optics, she saw a man, older than she expected, moving with the deliberate economy of someone who had spent a lifetime practicing not being seen. He was carrying a packaged system on his back, the rifle broken down, she understood immediately, not assembled, because he had finished his work and was transitioning to exfil. He was not expecting contact. He had never expected contact, because no one had ever come close enough to make contact a consideration. She had the shot. She did not take it. She keyed her radio 3 times, the signal for visual contact, positive identification, and held her position. Part 8. The shot and its weight. What happened next took 4 seconds, and in the after-action report it would be described as a standard close contact interdiction. What the report would not describe, because reports do not have the vocabulary for it, was the single moment between her third radio key and the sound of the containment team moving, during which she had the man in her optics and understood for certain what she had suspected for hours. Raymond Holt, 67 years old now, the beard longer, all white, moving through the pre-dawn desert with the same economy of motion she remembered from Nevada, the same way of putting his feet down that suggested he was never, at any moment, off balance. She did not know why he had done what he had done. She did not know who he was working for or what the 12 dead men had represented to whoever had hired him. She knew only that she had been the only person in the task force who could have found him, because she was the only person who had been trained by him, who had learned to think the way he thought and therefore knew where to look. He was in her optics for 8 seconds. He sensed the containment team before he saw them. She could tell by the way his posture changed, the slight stiffening, the reevaluation. And then Garland's element came around the south corner of the collapsed section, and Vickers' element came from the north, and Raymond Holt stood in the space between them with nowhere to go and put his hands up. He did not fight. She had known he wouldn't. He was a craftsman, not a martyr. She kept him in her optics while Garland moved in with the restraints, and she watched him scan the darkness around the perimeter, looking for the asset who had found him. She understood, because he would know by the geometry of the containment, that someone had been watching the eastern face, someone who had known exactly where to look, and his eyes swept across her position in the dark and stopped. He couldn't see her. She was behind cover, no light, full concealment, but he stopped scanning and held very still and stayed that way for a moment that lasted longer than the situation required. He said something. She couldn't hear it at 200 meters in the pre-dawn silence. She lowered her rifle. She thought he might have been saying her name. Part 9. What the silence contains. Dawn came hard and fast the way it always did in the desert. No gradual lightening, but a sudden shift from dark to orange to brutal white. By the time they were back at the warehouse, The temperature had already crossed 80 degrees and was climbing toward the day's honest intent. Raymond Holt sat in a folding chair with his hands zip-tied behind him and said nothing. He had said nothing since his capture, and his expression was the expression of a man who has completed a calculation and is not surprised by the result. He looked at Nora once, when she entered the room. His face did not change, but something behind it did, a very small shift, like a weight settling. Price conducted the initial questioning himself, which was irregular and indicated that he understood the capture as significant enough to put his own hands on. He asked about employers, about the mission, about the origin of the contract. Holt answered none of it. After 20 minutes, Price left the room with the collected silence of a man reorganizing his understanding of several things at once. Vickers found Nora outside, sitting on the shaded side of the warehouse with a water bottle she had not yet opened. "You knew him," Vickers said. "It wasn't entirely a question. He trained me." Vickers absorbed this without visible reaction. He sat down on the concrete beside her, which was a companionable gesture she had not expected from him. "How long did it take you to figure out it was him?" "Somewhere in the middle of the night before last." The operational signature, the specific use of thermal windows, the reflected fire angles, the subsurface positioning. She looked at the bottle in her hands. "He taught me all of it. I recognized the handwriting. You should have said something sooner. I needed to be certain before I named a specific man. If I'd said, 'I think I know who this is,' and been wrong, every piece of analysis I offered afterward would have been discredited. I needed the geometry to confirm it first." A pause. "I had confirmation by mid-morning yesterday. I submitted the position analysis within the hour." Vickers looked at the street. A dust devil was forming at the intersection 50 meters east, a small spinning column that would last about 30 seconds before the crosswind took it apart. "The coast incident," he said. "What about it?" "There's a different version of that story in the classified file. I read it last night." He paused. "The second version says you identified a civilian presence in the target vehicle that the intelligence assessment had missed, that you called an audible and aborted the shot based on direct observation. There wasn't a way to preserve the mission objective once I made the call. I aborted. The mission failed. It saved 4 lives. It also got me labeled as unreliable." Vickers picked up a small piece of gravel and turned it in his fingers for a moment, then set it down. "Labels are written by whoever's holding the pen." She opened the water bottle and drank. They sat for a while in the thinning shade. The temperature would reach 115 by noon, and the shade would be a memory by 10, but for now there was enough of it to make the concrete supportable. Somewhere inside the building, the sound of equipment being logged and cleared moved steadily through the morning quiet. "He's good," Vickers said finally. Not a question, not a provocation. Just an acknowledgement delivered in the flat tone of someone who extended professional respect only where it was unambiguously earned. "He was the best I've ever seen," she said. "He may still be, and you found him. I knew what to look for. That's not the same as being better." Vickers considered this. "In this work, knowing what to look for is most of it. The rest is execution. You had both." She did not argue the point. Arguing it would have required a false modesty she didn't feel and didn't think he would have respected anyway. What she felt was closer to something complicated, not pride, not satisfaction, but the specific and somewhat uncomfortable sensation of having been exactly the right instrument for a problem she would rather had not existed. Holt was in a folding chair somewhere because of her. That was true and real, and she was not going to arrange herself in a way that made it easier to carry. Part 10. The weight of being right. Price found her at 1100 hours, standing at the same spot on the warehouse's eastern wall where she had stood on the first morning. He came alone, without aids, which she noted because it was inconsistent with every movement she had observed him make in the previous 30 hours. He stood beside her and looked at the street, the shimmer building again in the mid-morning heat, the skeleton buildings. Neither of them spoke for almost a full minute. "The incident at Coast," he said finally. "The version in your file is the wrong version." She said nothing. "I've read the unredacted assessment. What you identified in that vehicle, the civilian presence, the analysis team missed it at the initial stage and at the review stage. You caught it in the field, in a 6-second observation window, through a scope, under conditions that made any reliable observation difficult. The mission commander wrote the incident report in terms that protected the intelligence failure by characterizing your decision as operator hesitation. He kept his eyes on the street. That characterization was wrong." She waited. "Your analysis of the firing position was correct. Your route assessment was correct. The capture was the direct result of your preparation and your patience." A pause. I underestimated you. I said so in front of your unit and I was wrong. That matters. You were working from the file, she said. I was working from the file and from a set of assumptions that I should have suspended pending direct observation. I've been doing this long enough to know better than that, and I didn't do better. He finally looked at her. He had the look of a man who had reorganized something important in himself and was not particularly comfortable with the process, but was committed to its completion. An apology worth anything takes more than a conversation. Yes, she said. It does. He nodded. He seemed to have prepared himself for an easier version of this moment and found, on arrival, that she was not interested in making it easy for him and to have respected her for it. What happens to Holt? She asked. That's above both our pay grades. He paused. He asked about you. When I went back in for the second session, he said, and I'm quoting him directly, "Tell whoever found me that they shouldn't have waited so long to say what they knew." Price looked at the street again. I believe he was talking about more than last night. She considered that for a moment. I'll take it under advisement, she said. Price almost smiled. The expression didn't quite form, but the territory around his mouth shifted in that direction, and then he turned and walked back inside. She stood in the heat and the light and didn't move for a while. She thought about the transfer request in her pocket. She thought about what it would mean to say yes. Not the operational details, not the logistics, but what it would mean in the quiet way of a decision made about how you were willing to be used. She had spent 4 years in assignments that used the wrong version of her, the version that existed in the wrong file, the version whose most defining action had been rendered as a failure because failure was a simpler story than what had actually happened. Saying yes to Vickers and Merritt would mean choosing to be known accurately, which was its own kind of exposure. You could not be seen correctly and also remain invisible. She was not certain, standing there in the heat outside a warehouse in a dead city, that she was ready to give up the protection that invisibility had provided. But she also thought about what Holt had said, filtered through Price's careful delivery. Shouldn't have waited so long to say what they knew. She had been thinking of it as a comment about the tactical analysis, about the extra day she had spent confirming before she spoke. But the more she turned it over, the more she thought the reference was longer than that. He had known her when she was 23 and already learning the habit of silence. He had watched her do it with a precision that suggested he had recognized it as a pattern, not just a tactical choice. She folded her hand around the paper in her pocket without taking it out. Epilogue. She left Marwa at 1400, in the back of a logistics vehicle heading to the airfield 40 kilometers south. The town shrank behind her and then disappeared into the shimmer, and then the shimmer itself flattened and became indistinguishable from the rest of the desert, which was the way the desert absorbed everything eventually. Vickers had handed her a folded piece of paper before she got in the vehicle. She opened it now. It was a formal transfer request, authored by Vickers, endorsed by Merritt, requesting Sergeant First Class Nora Calloway for reassignment to Task Force Meridian as primary long-range fire specialist. There was a note in Merritt's handwriting in the margin. Your call. No pressure. But we'd be idiots. She folded it back up and put it in her chest pocket. The vehicle moved through the flat desert at a steady speed, the driver not speaking, the sound of the engine, a constant that after 20 minutes stopped registering as sound and became instead the texture of the moving silence. Through the window, the landscape offered nothing to distinguish 1 kilometer from another, the same pale ground, the same low haze, the same absolute indifference of a place that had been here long before anyone drove through it and would be here long after the road itself had been reclaimed. There was a kind of comfort in that, she found. The desert did not have an opinion about her file. It did not know about Coast or the incident report or the 4 years of assignments that had used her carelessly. It was simply there, and she was moving through it, and in some months or years, the sand would redistribute itself and the track she was leaving would no longer exist, and that would be true of everything she had done here too. The drainage channel approach, the pre-dawn patience, the moment she had held her shot and keyed the radio instead. It would exist in reports and in her own memory and in whatever Raymond Holt carried out of whatever room he ended up in. But the desert itself would not remember any of it, and there was something in that impermanence that felt, unexpectedly, like permission. She had done her work. She had done it correctly and without recognition until after the fact, and she had not needed the recognition in order to do it. That much she knew with certainty. But she was beginning to understand, sitting in the back of this vehicle with the transfer request in her chest pocket and the desert moving past, that not needing recognition was different from not wanting it, that the discipline she had developed over 4 years of being seen incorrectly had hardened into something that functioned like independence but had the texture, on examination, of withdrawal. She had stopped asking to be seen because she had stopped expecting accurate vision, and that was its own kind of damage. Maybe the paper in her pocket was a beginning of something. Maybe it wasn't. She gave herself permission to not know yet. She thought about Raymond Holt in that folding chair, hands restrained behind his back, looking at her with the expression of a man who has completed a long calculation and found the answer was precisely what he expected. She thought about what he had said to Price, that whoever found him should not have waited so long to say what they knew. She was not certain whether he meant the tactical analysis she had developed and held for one additional day of confirmation, or whether he meant something older. Something about the years she had spent carrying the wrong story about herself. The story someone else had written in a report file, while she had been in the field making a correct decision that looked, from the outside, like failure. There was a difference, she understood now, between being patient and being silent out of habit, between waiting for the right moment and waiting because waiting had become automatic, because the weight of the wrong label had made her careful in ways that had cured into something resembling caution, but were actually closer to absence. He had taught her to read the air, the light, the temperature gradient between here and there. He had not taught her when to speak. Maybe that one she had to figure out on her own. The desert ran in all directions, flat and bright, and entirely indifferent to the small vehicle moving through it. She put her head back against the seat and closed her eyes and felt the motion of it, carrying her south towards something she had not yet decided about. The most dangerous person in any field is not the one who announces what they can do. It is the one who has long since stopped needing to. She had learned that from a man she had just put in restraints. She supposed that was, in its way, the most complete thing he had ever taught her. The lessons that cost the teacher something, that required them to be found, to be known, to be caught in the long act of doing what they had always done, were the ones that lasted. Everything else was instruction. That was education. The airfield appeared on the horizon as a flat smear of gray against the pale ground. She watched it resolve itself into recognizable shapes: the hangar, the windsock, the small cluster of vehicles near the flight operations building, and thought about nothing in particular. The vehicle slowed. The driver said something over his shoulder about paperwork. She picked up her pack from the floor, checked that the transfer request was still in her pocket, and stepped out into the heat of the afternoon, which hit her like a reminder that the day was not finished yet.